Shining Force 2 might just be my favorite game ever. It's difficult to even start talking about this game. For me, Shining Force 2 is everything that I love about my childhood, and in that way I'm pretty biased when it comes to discussing it. But I feel like most people who still talk about Shining Force these days are diehard fans, and of those diehard fans, it seems to me that they usually tend to gravitate towards the original game. But for me, there's absolutely no contest. I like the original Shining Force, but I love Shining Force 2. Before I get too deep into things, let's go over the story a bit. First things first, the story of Shining Force 2 has almost nothing to do with the original Shining Force. A Game Gear game called Shining Force Gaiden Final Conflict was released to try and bridge the story between the two, but you don't need to have played the original Shining Force or Shining Force Gaiden Final Conflict to enjoy and understand everything there is in Shining Force 2. This time we're treated to a really long opening cutscene that plays out the events that bring us to the beginning of the game. I personally find this to be more engaging than the still images of the first game, but that could just be a personal preference. We're introduced to Slade, the thief who ends up stealing the jewels of light and evil. This unleashes devils onto our world, with the goal of resurrecting the Demon King Xeon. We play as Bowie of Grand Seal, the leader of this new Shining Force. Bowie, as well as Sarah the Elf Priest, Chester the Centaur Knight, and Jaha the Dwarven Warrior, are all students of the Wizard Astral, who is called to investigate the strange happenings of the previous night. It turns out a messenger from Galam was killed, and they believe Grand Seal to be at fault. The Force is captured by Galam, where they meet up with Slade in jail. Before long, war breaks out between Galam and Grand Seal, and the Force escapes to the mainland, where they rebuild Grand Seal, but not before Princess Ellis is kidnapped by the demons. On the mainland, we meet Peter the Phoenix, or Fink, or Phoenix Kid, unsure on that, and we set out to thwart the resurrection of Xeon and save Princess Ellis. Obviously, there's more to it than that, but the story is so much fun and takes so many twists and turns that I don't want to spoil any more than that. Shining Force 2 does a fantastic job of making the player feel like they are in control of what's going on, rather than just having a story told to them. After playing through the Shining Force Gaiden games, it's really refreshing to have so much autonomy in the story. Instead of just fighting a battle, then watching a cutscene, a lot of the cutscenes are triggered by interacting with specific characters or objects, or going to specific places. It really adds to the feeling of being part of the story, rather than just watching cutscenes in between gameplay. I really like that Bowie is a silent protagonist, but still gets a couple of lines in. In previous Shining Force games, the main protagonist is always silent, maybe just mumbling a little bit. This is a trope often found in RPGs so that the player can more easily identify with their avatar. While Bowie is silent for most of the game, he does actually have a couple of lines throughout the story, usually things that the player might be thinking already, and it was really nice to be able to see his portrait be used in dialogue throughout the game. Now, a problem that pretty much all Shining Force games tend to have is that since there are so many characters, most of them don't have much of a role in the story. This is certainly true for Shining Force 2 as well, but it's done better here. In previous games, a character would usually get a couple of lines of dialogue when you meet them, and nothing after that. But there are other characters that you come across along the way who have more lines than just, "I'm bored, can I join you?" Although, those characters also exist. Rick? Peter, Slade, and Lemon end up playing major roles in the game's story, Peter especially, although I wish that Slade had more of a role in the end of the game. He doesn't hardly speak after you get out of jail. I found this to be really strange, and I think the manual puts it best. This is the guy who caused the whole mess. It just feels like a kind of wasted potential, especially since he's such a cool character. Aside from them though, most characters have a bit of a story at least. Let's look at Freyja for instance. He tries to cut off the devils by locking the gates of Mouth, but unfortunately just made it easier for the devils to get to the people living inside. Because of this, he feels that he is at fault and joins you to try and redeem himself. The game even forces him into your party at this point since the battle is essentially his big story moment. It's touching, and if you work with him, Freyja can actually be a really good character. In fact, most of the cast can be pretty useful if you stick with them. Except Kiwi. Come on, man, you're a giant Gamera monster stomping through cliffs and trees and you're only hitting for 2 damage? What is that? Oh my god, why don't you always breathe fire? But Peter is by far the best character, and yes, his name is Peter, even though the instruction book says his name is Ash. Maybe there was a prototype name in the translation? His name in Japanese is still Peter. He can get an enormous health pool late in game, and he knows how to take a punch. The dude also hits like a truck, but my favorite character has always been Slade. Later in the game, he can learn magic, and if you know what you're doing, you can get him a weapon that has a chance to slice enemies in half for a one-hit kill. I'm like a shadow of the night, silent and deadly. Oh my god, he's so goddamn cool! The cast of Shining Force 2 is also very diverse. The best thing about the original Shining Force is that it has its diverse roster of combatants, and Shining Force 2 doesn't disappoint. I think there's more variety in the original game, but the selection in Shining Force 2 is far better than the Shining Force Gaiden games. However, where Shining Force 2 makes up for this is in the character portraits and graphics. The colors in Shining Force 2 are much brighter than they are in the original, and the sprites and portraits have much more detail. Just take a look at the kings compared to the ones in Shining Force 1, or just the fact that multiple characters have different portraits upon promotion. And see the sand in the desert battle in Shining Force 1? Kinda boring if you ask me. But this desert battle in Shining Force 2 looks gorgeous. There's just so much more detail in the presentation of Shining Force 2. The mechanics overall are much more refined as well. The most important, in my opinion anyway, is that you can hit the C button to instantly talk to or interact with people and objects in the game instead of having to go through the menu. Now, it may seem like a small thing, but trust me, it makes a big difference. On top of that, interacting with townsfolk is much easier now as well. Their hitbox when you talk to them gets extended as they walk, so they don't end up running away from you when you try and talk to them, which seemed to happen to me all the time in the original Shining Force. And speaking of townsfolk, Shining Force 2 brings back the towns from the original game. I didn't realize how much I missed these. After playing through Shining Force CD and Shining Force Gaiden Final Conflict, which are only made up of battles, it's great to be able to roam around towns freely. Scratch that, in Shining Force 2 you can roam around pretty much the whole map freely. Shining Force 2 ditches the chapter system of previous games and instead goes for a more open world feel. Obviously, you are usually locked into specific areas until a certain task is accomplished, like talk to a specific NPC or unlock a new method of travel, but it definitely makes the world feel more like a real place. We get to experience how the entire Shining Force 2 world is interconnected and where each town is in relation to others. Due to the chapter system and the inability to backtrack in the original game, we don't get to revisit old characters, but in Shining Force 2 we do, and a lot of the time they have new dialogue, or you may even be able to get items you left behind or even recruit new members that you couldn't before. I will say, however, that the world can be a little confusing to navigate through. A lot of stuff looks the same and there's no big map to look at aside from in the instruction booklet, so it's easy to get lost, but after a couple of hours of running through the game, you start to get a real lay of the land, so to speak. And although the world is pretty big, it's never annoying to travel through. We're playing this on Sega Genesis, the console known for speed, and accordingly, our main character zooms across the map really quickly. In fact, most of the enemies are also super speedy. Just look at how much faster the cursor moves compared to the original game. They really put that blast processing to work. This makes battles much more fast-paced and exciting. There's also new spells, classes, and items to use this time around, so there's a lot to play around with here. The battlefields that you fight in aren't as well designed as they are in Sword of Haja, at least in my opinion, but the overall streamlined nature make the battles in Shining Force 2 much more addictive than any of the other 8 or 16-bit Shining Force games. Although, the music definitely plays a big part in this. The music in Shining Force 2 is absolutely incredible. From energetic battle themes to spiritualistic hymns and everything in between, the soundtrack is absolutely amazing. One of my all-time favorite video game OSTs ever. I will admit the 2 main battle themes probably get played a bit too much, but they're good enough that it never got annoying, at least for me anyway. But what I absolutely loved were the battles that took place in shrines or sacred places, and they would have softer themes playing in the background. I always managed to fight these battles during my late night play sessions, and it was a great way to relax before going to bed. It's actually amazing how different the tone of battle could be just by the different type of music that would play during it. These signature Shining Force battle animations make a return, of course, and they are more gorgeous than ever. Characters have a lot of frames of animation and all look very different from each other. Even the ones who are just palette swaps, like the Master Monks or the Barons, still feel like different characters due to the wide variety in colors chosen. Enemies look great as well, and I especially love the battle with the Kraken and the chess battle. I think those are two of the most memorable fights in the game, and also the two hardest. It's hard for me to pinpoint what exactly makes Shining Force 2 so much better than the original game, in my opinion. Perhaps the graphics, the colors, the music, or maybe just my nostalgia for the game, but I constantly found myself wanting to play. I was brought back to high school when I would stay up till 2 or 3 in the morning on a school night just to finish another battle or two. I found myself doing the exact same thing again and loving every second of it. I think it's charm. Shining Force 2 has a lot of charm. That's not to say the first game didn't have charm, because it definitely did, but in a different way. There's a lot of small details and Easter eggs hidden in the game, and finding these little secrets is so much fun. And the fun part about it being a sequel is that it's able to reference the older material, and I love that. Shining Force 2 never goes overboard on the fan service, it just peppers in little hints to the first game that are just enough to satisfy the player. And I think that's what makes it such a good entry point for newcomers to the series. It's such a contained story that you could play it without knowing anything about the other Shining Force games and still get just as much joy out of it as someone who's been a fan for their whole life. Heck, that's what I did my first time playing through. In fact, Shining Force 2 was my first introduction to tactical RPGs ever. As great as I think the original Shining Force is, the streamlined nature of Shining Force 2 makes it much better suited for newcomers. However, it isn't without its flaws. The game is still very reliant on RNG, or randomness. Sometimes you just get unlucky. It can go both ways, but it's definitely more annoying to be the human losing to bad RNG than to be a machine. For some battles, it's also difficult to tell who the enemy leader is. Many times I was getting near the end of a battle and all of a sudden it would just end because I killed the leader without realizing it. It can be good if you're struggling to win in the end, but annoying if you're trying to get as much XP off a battle as you can. I also hate losing a battle right at the end, only to have to go through the entire fight over again. This is more of a general complaint about all tactical RPGs in general, but the battles can last up to 45 minutes and having to go through the whole thing again is really frustrating, especially if you just lost because of bad RNG. Shining Force 2 also does a terrible job at explaining what items do. As far as I could tell, there were no in-game descriptions of what an item's function is. Now, for healing seeds and fairy tears, you can usually take a good guess at what they do, but for items like the silver tank or a vigor ball, it can be really confusing if you aren't using an online guide. And the manual doesn't help either, as it only gives vague hints or flat out doesn't mention some items. But I want to focus on those items that I just mentioned. Shining Force 2 has special items in it that, once you look up how to use them, can grant characters an alternate promotion. For example, instead of promoting the priest Sarah into a vicar, with a vigor ball, she can be promoted to a master monk, where she not only has a better looking battle animation, but she also deals massive damage, making her both a great healer and a fighter. This of course makes Shining Force 2 incredibly replayable. Since all the secret characters aren't hidden in obscure places, you'll probably find most, if not all of them, on your first playthrough, even without a walkthrough, at least if you're actually looking for them. This makes replaying the game really fun, because you know who you'll meet, and you can try out different team compositions and try promoting characters to different classes. However, a lot of these promotional items that I just mentioned are hidden in really obscure places, so you will definitely need a walkthrough to find at least some of them. I think one of my favorite parts is when you get to Creed's mansion and have to pick between one of 4 characters to bring to the group. The first time I played, I picked Karna, the priest, since I really needed a healer, and I'm pretty sure most people end up picking her too. But this time I went for Tyrion because I accidentally promoted Kazan before realizing he could become a sorcerer instead of a wizard. Sorcerers get access to an entire different arsenal of spells, and it was a really fun challenge to get through the mid-game with a really powerful sorcerer, but without Karna to give me the extra heals. You can still come back for these characters afterwards, but you'll have to do a bit of grinding if you want to get them up to speed with the rest of the force. What I'm saying is that there's a lot of room for customizability in who is on your team, and it's really well done. Okay, so I want to go over some more spoilery stuff, so if you haven't played Shining Force 2 before, please do yourself a favor and skip to the timestamp on screen right now. You've been warned. I think one of the most iconic scenes in all of Shining Force has to be when the Nazca ship takes flight. It's just so freaking cool! Like, I know it's probably an overused trope, but I love the whole fantastical ancient technology thing, and that's something that Shining Force has always really been about, and it makes it stand out from other fantasy-themed games. The scene where the ship just pulls out of the sand just really sticks out in my mind as something from Shining Force 2. The character Lemon also has always stuck out in my mind. I didn't really remember much of his story before playing through this time. I really only remembered that he got turned into a vampire. But now that I've played through it again, his story is really tragic. He was just a commander who loved and was loyal to his kingdom, only to be betrayed and turned into a vampire, unable to die for his sins, at least until the very end, where he makes the ultimate sacrifice to save the world. I love this ending so much. Bowie is important and the main character, but it's really refreshing to have a character other than the main player to be the one to save the day, especially since it was so permanent too. Lemon doesn't make it back. It's a bittersweet ending, but the Red Baron was able to redeem himself in the end. I also just really love him as a character. His portrait always reminded me of the red cards from Alice in Wonderland, and he has the same revivability that Peter does, where he doesn't need to be brought back in a church. And he's also just really strong, especially when you equip the Rune Axe and keep the Dark Sword on him so that he can use its D-Soul ability. Definitely the unsung hero of Shining Force 2. Now you may think that the story is pretty good versus evil, considering the jewels of light and evil. However, that's not entirely the case. Two characters in particular show that in the world of Shining Force 2, there can be a middle ground. Adler, or as you find out his real name to be Odd-Eye, the Devil, starts off as a seemingly good amnesiac kid, but eventually we find out he's this evil devil, but he doesn't really want to be. Similarly to Lemon, he just wants a shot at being good now. He's realized the error of his ways and he wants to move on. But perhaps more interestingly is the character Creed. Creed is pretty much objectively evil, like he talks with evil spirits, but he understands that Xeon is going to destroy the world, so he sets aside his differences to help out Bowie in the Shining Force in order to save the world, essentially. He's not on your side, but he's definitely not on Xeon's side either, and that middle ground is really fascinating and something that you really don't ever see explored, especially not in old video games. And now, there was another point in the game that really struck a chord with me, especially on this playthrough. It wasn't a scripted moment or anything like that. I was just walking around the map as normal, and all of a sudden the screen went dark. I thought I'd triggered a battle, but I had been taken to the Elven Town. Somehow, I had totally forgot that it even existed, and as soon as I entered, I was instantly taken back to the first time that I played this game as a kid, and I felt that same magic. The beautiful music, the natural scenery, it was like how people say they want to watch a movie they love for the first time again. I had succeeded in finding that feeling. If you have even the slightest desire to get into either the Shining Force series or strategy RPGs in general, there is no better game to start with than Shining Force 2. It takes things slow. You start off with a small team, and each new battle, only 1 or 2 new enemies are added and maybe a new spell. It eases the player into the world of strategy RPGs and does so with a beautiful presentation and quality of life improvements not found in the other Shining Force games. It's also incredibly accessible, being available on Steam, the Genesis or Mega Drive collection on the Switch and other platforms, and most impressive, you can play it on your phone for free. I like to stick with the original cartridge myself, but please, play it any way that you can. Shining Force 2 deserves to go down with the greats like Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy VI. I truly believe that it is that great. I want to give a big thanks to my high school Spanish teacher for recommending this game to me as a kid, as it truly changed my gaming life. And of course I want to thank all of you for watching. Up next on my Shining Force hit list will be the infamous Shining Force 3. I'll be starting off with the American release, but rest assured, I will be taking a look at the Japanese exclusive scenarios 2 and 3. I've never played any of them before, so I'm looking forward to it. I'm Bofner, and I'll see you all next time. But I'm not gonna defend the box art. Bowie's pecs always were kind of weird to me.